Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive.
Definitely.
Today, we're looking at, well, it's kind of what-if scenario. What happens, I think, the Assad regime in Syria falls?
Big question.
Big question, yeah. And our sources today really focus on one particular group, Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, HTS for short.
Right. Powerful force in the region.
Powerful is one way to put it. They have a, let's say, a complicated history.
Yeah, shrouded in controversy, you could say.
Exactly. So these reports and analysis we're diving into today lay out some pretty fascinating scenarios, like how they might govern, how they might try to change perceptions of Assad.
Yeah, manage that legacy.
Exactly. And even, get this, rebrand themselves on the world stage. We're going in with, open minds here.
Gotta be objective.
Got to be objective, see the possibilities, the challenges, all that's laid out in these sources.
And have the listener come to their own conclusions.
Exactly. So, where do we even begin with all this? The sources paint a pretty complex picture, especially with HTS's, their past.
Yeah, it's interesting because the sources, they really emphasize moving beyond just asking what if Assad falls. It's more about what happens next.
Right, the consequences.
Consequences, exactly. And specifically looking at those scenarios involving HTS and, how they could potentially shape post-Assad Syria.
Okay, so, what are the biggest hurdles? Where do the challenges lie for them?
Well, our sources point to, a mountain of obstacles inside Syria and, on that global stage.
Both.
Both, yeah. Let's start with those internal ones. Syria's deeply fractured, ethnically, religiously, ideologically. You've got former Assad loyalists.
Right.
You've got minorities who are, they're wary of persecution. And, secular Syrians who might just flat out reject HTS and their Islamist background.
There's a lot of division to overcome.
Yeah.
So, given all that, how could HTS even begin to convince, a population that's gone through so much trauma, to accept them as, a legitimate governing force?
Our sources say that rebuilding trust is absolutely critical. We're talking about, a monumental task here. Bridging that gap, right, between their jihadist past and, well, whatever their future vision might be, a future of inclusive governance.
Right. How do you bridge that?
They'd need to show a real commitment to inclusivity, maybe through a coalition government, something that represents, Syria's diverse makeup.
Makes sense.
And make it clear that, strict Islamic law, it's not going to be imposed on everyone.
Right. That's a big concern, I imagine, for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
Okay, so even if they can manage, the political side of things, what about the economy? Our sources describe Syria's infrastructure as basically decimated after years of conflict.
Yeah, some sources compare it to rebuilding a house on quicksand. And that's a pretty apt analogy.
Yeah.
Widespread poverty, unemployment, you're talking about a completely shattered economy. Rebuilding would be, a Herculean task. And HTS's reputation, well, it could scare away potential investors, foreign aid, the whole 9 yards.
Okay, so we've got this incredibly complex internal picture. What happens when we kind of zoom out, look at the region, the international context? What then?
Oh, it gets even more complicated when you factor in the regional dynamics.
Yeah, because it's not just Syria, right?
It's not just Syria. Syria is right at the heart of, this geopolitical pressure cooker. You've got Turkey, you've got Iran, you've got Israel, even the Kurdish-led SDF. They've all got their own agendas, their own interests.
Stakes in the game.
Stakes in the game, exactly.
So how does HTS navigate all that? Each of these actors, they want to influence a post-Assad Syria. Take Turkey, for example. They've supported HTS in the past.
Right.
But now they might want, more control in northern Syria. Then you've got Iran. They could back efforts to, well, destabilize HTS, make things difficult for them.
Yeah.
And then there's Israel. Can't forget them. They've been carrying out those airstrikes against Iranian-backed militias in Syria for years.
Right.
So if they see HTS as a threat, well, those airstrikes could escalate. It's a lot to balance.
It is.
So it sounds like HTS would need to play, a very careful game of chess here to navigate all these competing interests and keep the whole region from, spiraling into more conflict.
Absolutely. And then on top of all of that, you've got the issue of international recognition.
Right, the world stage.
The world stage. Given their history, it's hard to imagine, the global community welcoming them with open arms.
Yeah, that past, it's a big hurdle. Likely crippling sanctions.
Yeah.
Which would, further devastate Syria's economy.
Right.
They'd be operating in, a diplomatic no man's land.
Yeah, they would.
So is the takeaway here that even if HTS manages to take control, actually governing, achieving any kind of stability, is it just like near impossible?
The odds are definitely stacked against them, but, our sources, they're not completely pessimistic.
Oh, okay.
They do outline some potential strategies, things HTS might use to, well, overcome these challenges.
Okay, a plan. I'm all ears.
And that's where things get really interesting.
What are they thinking?
Economically speaking, they'd want to focus on attracting major investments to, kickstart that rebuilding process.
Right.
The sources suggest they'd probably approach nations that might be sympathetic, like Turkey, maybe Qatar, and even try to court private investors, to fund that reconstruction of vital infrastructure, roads, hospitals, schools, all that.
It sounds like a long shot. I mean, who would trust them with that kind of money, given their, let's say, complicated past?
That's the challenge, right?
Huge challenge.
To counter that, the sources highlight this plan HTS has to establish what are known as special economic zones.
Okay, what's that?
So these are areas with, incredibly favorable conditions for foreign companies.
Like what?
We're talking, tax breaks, streamlined regulations, all sorts of incentives to attract investment and, boost that economic activity.
So it's like they're trying to appeal to, like, economic self-interest.
Yeah.
More than, ideological purity.
Right.
Is that a viable strategy for them, though?
It's certainly a pragmatic approach.
Yes.
And beyond attracting that outside investment, they're also looking at, revising Syria's agricultural sector.
Interesting.
Our sources point out they seem to understand that empowering farmers, that's crucial, to boosting food production, improving livelihoods, particularly in those rural areas.
Yeah, I mean, Syria used to be like a breadbasket, right? Known for their agriculture.
Exactly.
It makes sense they'd want to, like, tap back into that potential.
They're considering subsidies for farmers, distributing seeds and equipment, investing in things like irrigation systems, to address that economic crisis.
Okay, so rebuilding agriculture.
But, what about the elephant in the room? The Syrian currency. After years of war, sanctions, it's basically worthless, right?
Right.
How do you stabilize that?
That's another piece of the economic plan. They're actually proposing to introduce a brand new currency.
Whoa, really? Potentially pegged to a more stable currency, like maybe the Turkish lira. The goal is to combat, that hyperinflation, create a more stable environment for their economy, obviously.
A new currency. Wow. It sounds like they're aiming to build, like, a whole new Syria from scratch.
It's ambitious, for sure.
Is it even feasible? Remotely?
It's a massive undertaking. Our sources stress that launching a new currency, it requires serious financial reforms, to combat corruption, build trust in that new system.
Right.
They'd need to demonstrate transparency, accountability, especially if they want to attract those international donors and investors.
So, okay, ambitious plans for economic recovery. But let's be real. Even if they manage to pull all that off, there's still the issue of their image.
Yeah, big one.
Can HTS actually shed, that extremist past
Tough question.
and convince the world that they've, like, fundamentally changed?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
It is.
And our sources suggest that HTS is very aware of this challenge. They seem to understand that, rebranding is critical to achieving any kind of lasting success.
So a makeover. What does that even look like? What are they proposing specifically?
Well, the sources outline a multifaceted approach. First and foremost, they'd need to make a clean break with their past.
Yeah.
That means publicly, unequivocally, renouncing those ties to al-Qaeda.
Oh, wow. Big move.
Other extremist groups, too. They'd have to convince the world, that those alliances are truly in the past, no longer relevant to their goals.
I mean, I can imagine that's easier said than done.
For sure.
There's a lot of, baggage there.
A lot of baggage.
But even if they distance themselves from al-Qaeda, there's still the question of their ideology. At their core, there's still an Islamist group.
Right.
So how do they reconcile that with, like, a more moderate, inclusive approach to governing?
The sources suggest that adopting a more moderate interpretation of Islamic law, that's another key part of this rebranding strategy. They'd need to demonstrate a respect for the rights of minorities, secular Syrians, make it clear that they wouldn't impose strict Sharia law on everyone.
So essentially, they're walking this tightrope, right? Trying to appeal to, like, a broader audience without alienating their base.
It is a delicate balancing act.
Do the sources offer any insight into how they might pull that off?
Yeah, the sources indicate that emphasizing national unity would be key,
Okay.
portraying themselves as like protectors of Syria's sovereignty. They might try to tap into that sense of, shared Syrian identity, focus on rebuilding the nation rather than, imposing a specific ideology.
That makes sense. It's a classic strategy, right? Playing that nationalist card.
It is.
But at the end of the day, actions speak louder than words. So what concrete actions could they take to actually demonstrate a genuine change?
That's where good governance becomes essential. The sources suggest that showcasing tangible successes, in areas they already control, that would be crucial. They need to demonstrate that they can, effectively provide essential services, maintain security,
Yeah.
create a stable environment for people to actually live in.
So it's about proving they can actually govern,
Oh.
that they're not just another, militia group vying for power.
Exactly.
They need to show they can run a functioning state,
Yeah.
not just, wage war.
Exactly. And there's another kind of intriguing element to their potential strategy
Ooh, what's that?
that we haven't touched on yet. Their plan for managing the narrative around Bashar al-Assad's legacy.
Now, that's fascinating. I mean, how do you deal with the legacy of a regime that's been in power for decades?
The key.
His image is everywhere.
It is.
What do the sources say about how HTS might approach this?
They suggest that HTS would likely try to, systematically dismantle Assad's legacy.
Oh, wow.
That could involve, meticulously documenting his regime's crimes, the corruption,
Right.
launching media campaigns to expose, his brutality, removing symbols of his rule from public spaces.
So it's like a calculated strategy to discredit him, control that narrative. But wouldn't that risk turning him into, like, a martyr,
Yeah.
rallying his remaining supporters?
It's a risky move, for sure. The sources point out that they'd need to tread carefully.
Yeah, you don't want to make him a hero.
Avoid excessive vilification while still holding him accountable, for his actions.
That's a fun line to walk.
It is.
They need to strike a balance between, like, exposing the past and focusing on the future. I'm curious to know what the sources say about their vision for that future. They talked about, economic recovery, rebranding, but what about their overall goals for Syria?
That's where things become, I'd say, a bit more speculative. Our sources, they offer a range of possibilities,
Right.
from like a best case scenario where HTS successfully transitions to, a legitimate government,
Right.
brings stability, maybe even achieves, a degree of international acceptance,
The ideal outcome.
right? To, a worst case scenario where their attempt to govern, well, it leads to further chaos, collapse even.
So essentially, we're looking at, like, two starkly contrasting futures. One where HTS succeeds in, transforming Syria, and another where their efforts to seize power, well, they actually make things far worse.
Precisely. And understanding those potential outcomes, it requires us to, delve a little deeper
Yeah.
into the specific factors that could push things in one direction or the other.
Okay, this is already a lot to digest, but I'm definitely ready to explore those scenarios in more detail.
Let's do it.
Before we do, though, let's just kind of recap what we've learned so far.
Okay.
We've looked at those immense challenges HTS would face in a post-Assad Syria.
Right.
Internal divisions, economic devastation, regional rivalries, international skepticism.
That's a lot.
We've also explored some potential strategies they might employ, like attracting investment, revitalizing agriculture, launching a new currency,
Right. Rebranding
themselves.
managing Assad's legacy.
Managing Assad's legacy, that's a
Yeah.
big one.
Huge.
We've also highlighted, I think, that crucial point that their success or failure, it really hinges on their ability to govern effectively, gain the trust of the Syrian people,
Right.
navigate those, complex regional and international pressures,
That's a lot.
and most importantly, demonstrate a genuine commitment to change.
Actions speak louder than words.
They do. So now with all that, let's shift our focus to those contrasting futures,
Okay.
the best case and the worst case.
Okay.
What could a successful transition for HTS actually look like?
Right.
And what factors could lead to their downfall and, further destabilize Syria? Let's start with, that best case scenario. What could a successful transition for HTS actually look like? What would they need to accomplish to really gain legitimacy, not just control?
In a best case scenario, HTS manages to establish a functioning government. One that's seen as broadly legitimate, at least by, a significant portion of the Syrian population.
Okay.
This would involve, successfully implementing their plans for, economic recovery,
Mhm.
demonstrating a real commitment to inclusivity, human rights, and effectively navigating those, complex regional and international relationships.
So it's not just about staying in power.
Yeah.
It's about showing they can actually govern
Exactly.
and deliver on their promises,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
What specific signs should we be looking for to kind of gauge whether they're moving in that direction?
Well, one key indicator would be, tangible progress. On that economic front,
Right.
if they can attract investment, rebuild infrastructure, get people back to work, stabilize the currency.
The basics.
The basics, yeah. That would go a long way, towards building confidence in their leadership, domestically, internationally.
So essentially, they need to show that they're not just focused on consolidating power,
Right.
but on actually improving the lives of, ordinary Syrians.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
And beyond, economic progress, they'd also need to demonstrate a real commitment to inclusivity, human rights.
Big one.
That means ensuring the safety and security of all Syrian citizens, regardless of their ethnicity, their religion, their political affiliation.
We're talking about a huge shift,
It's a huge shift.
especially given their past.
They'd need to protect minority rights, uphold freedom of speech, assembly, create a system of governance that's, perceived as fair and just.
Those are lofty goals for a NY government,
Yeah, they are.
let alone one that emerged from a violent conflict with a history of, extremism.
Right, right.
What about the international community? Could HTS actually gain acceptance on the world stage?
It's a long shot, but, not entirely impossible. If they can demonstrate a clear break from their past, that extremist past, uphold those democratic principles, cooperate with, international efforts to combat terrorism, promote stability in the region,
Right.
they might eventually gain a degree of, international recognition support.
So it's a long and winding road. But there is a potential path
There is.
for HTS to achieve, some level of legitimacy success governing a post-Assad Syria. But let's be realistic, right? There's also a very real possibility that things could go in the completely opposite direction.
Oh, yeah.
What does that worst-case scenario look like? What could trigger their downfall?
Well, in a worst-case scenario, HTS fails to consolidate control.
Okay.
Leads to further fragmentation, instability. The country could, descend into chaos, various factions vying for power, potentially even a resurgence of groups like ISIS.
Oh, no.
The economy could completely collapse, leading to, widespread poverty, suffering, and the humanitarian crisis. Well, it could reach catastrophic levels.
It sounds like a nightmare scenario, not just for Syria, but for the whole region.
Absolutely.
What specific factors could push things in that direction? What should we be watching for?
Several factors could contribute, to HTS's failure. One major risk is that they just prove unable or unwilling to govern effectively.
Right, yeah.
If they can't deliver on those promises. Economic recovery, security, inclusivity,
Yeah,
they could quickly lose popular support
makes sense.
and face, widespread resistance, potentially even, armed uprisings.
So a failure to deliver could trigger a backlash, further destabilize the country.
It could.
Are there other kind of potential pitfalls they'd need to avoid?
Absolutely. Another major risk is that they alienate, key regional or international actors.
Okay.
If they fail to manage those complex relationships, they could provoke interventions, things that,
Yeah.
undermine their authority, fuel further conflict.
Yeah, no one wants that.
For example, if they're seen as too close to Turkey,
Right.
that could trigger a backlash from Iran. Other regional powers?
The balancing act.
It is.
So they're walking this tightrope, trying to maintain this balance of power in a region, that's rife with competing interests. What about their past, though? Could that, history of extremism come back to haunt them?
Definitely. Their past ties to al-Qaeda, it could make it really difficult for them to gain that international recognition support.
Right.
Potentially leading to, crippling sanctions, which would further damage the economy. They also risk being targeted by, groups like ISIS.
Really?
Yeah, who view them as, apostates.
Oh, wow.
So they face a whole array of challenges, right? Internal divisions, economic collapse, regional rivalries, international skepticism,
A lot on their plate.
and their own past actions. Well, those could come back to undermine their efforts, to
Yeah.
establish a stable and legitimate government.
It's a lot to take in. What's the key takeaway here for our listener?
I think the takeaway is the situation in Syria, it's incredibly complex and fluid. There are no easy answers. And the future remains, well, highly uncertain. HTS faces immense challenges in a post-Assad Syria. But they also have, a potential path towards success, however narrow and fraught with risk it may be.
We've explored those possibilities, the pitfalls,
Yeah.
today. Drawing on, the insights, the analyses provided by our sources,
Right.
we've examined that potential for, both success and failure, the strategies HTS might employ, the factors that could, shape the destiny of a nation.
Yeah.
But, as we always emphasize, this is just the starting point. We
Exactly.
provided, a framework for understanding this complex issue, but the real learning, well, that begins now.
What we've presented today is just one slice of, a much larger and more intricate story. We encourage you to continue exploring, to, delve deeper into the sources we've provided, and to seek out, additional perspectives, information, formulate your own opinions, challenge assumptions, and, engage in thoughtful discussions about the future of Syria.
Yeah, we've laid the groundwork, but the real deep dive, it's yours to take.
It is.
So thank you for joining us on this journey,
Appreciate it.
and we look forward to welcoming you back for our next exploration.